Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to the 2025 Q1 submission period midway webinar. So looking at the activity that's been going on in Researchfish since January 1st this year. So we look at this quarter when there are many different submission periods running. And the purpose of the webinar today is just to have a look through some of the key stats and metrics, see how we're doing, and contrast them with how things have gone in previous years. So we'll be going through a number of different figures. I'll talk through them. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. My colleague Alexandra is going to keep an eye on that. Yeah, we'll get going. So as I say, we're going to go through a number of different types of things that we typically go through. The first is what we call user activation. And so user activation is what we call when a user logs on to Researchfish for the first time in any calendar year. So this means it zeroes out at the end of the year. And then from January 1, we count each new login for the first time that user is active. And this gives us an idea of how many people have started doing different activities as part of the submission process. So step number one, people need to log in. And so this is why we look at this. What you'll see across all of these analyses, or most of these analyses, that we use a methodology called time shifting. So we essentially use the submission period as the anchor point, and we contrast a given date in one year with the equivalent date in another year based around the submission period dates rather than the strict calendar dates. So this introduces a little bit of variation, but gives us much better fidelity in that we're looking at the key dates that are driving behavior and counting out from that. So that's a note on user activation and a note on the time shifting methodology. So when we look at our first figure, we're going to look at essentially the annual user activation by day. So this is going to look at, you can see each of the individual dates and each of the individual number of people that have logged on for the first time on those dates. And we're going to look at 2020, which is going to be purple, 2021, which is green, 2022, which is that dark color, 23, which is brown, 24, which is blue, and last year, and sort of more immediate relevance, and then red, which is 2025, which is this year. So if we look at the 2020 patterns, you can see here there is strong indication of when the weekends are, and then there are a number of people that are active on each of those dates. And then you can see this is the end of the submission period. There's a large number of users logging on for the first time during that day. So that was in 2020. You'll see the patterns are quite similar year on year. So you can see in 2021. Now we're going to add in 2022 and 2023. And so you can see just subtle variations in what's visible because they're following a very, very similar pattern. 2024 is the one that we would look to as being obviously the most immediate one that we're more likely to track. And then finally 2025, which is red. And so from this, you should take the number of new activations are very similar. If we look at just the maximum and minimum points over that time period, you can see that at this point here, which was the start of the UK multi-funder submission period, we had a higher number of people on that particular day logging in, and then later in the week we had lower ones, and then we've generally tracked on the lower end of the difference between the maximum and the minimum time periods over that. But if we were to look just compare 2024 and 2025 and look at the differences on those individual days, you can see that we started off in January a little bit below in terms of new user activations. And then we finished January actually still fairly down. And then since then, the number has gradually been increasing day on day. So you can see the dark blue are increases, the orange are decreases, comparing that specific day last year and this year. And currently, we're about 500 activations higher than we were at this point last year. So more people have logged on for the first time overall. And you can see we've had more than 18,000 people so far log on for the first time using Researchfish. So you can see that there's actually quite a long way to go still. We're maybe about halfway there in terms of the users that we would expect to log in during Q1. And we're about, as I say, 500 above where we were this time last year. And you can see that out of the different years, there are three that are higher, one is essentially the same, and one was a little bit lower. And again, sort of maximum and minimum, we are on the sort of the lower end, but that's been a trend over recent years. So there was that 1 year that was quite exceptional, but we're actually much closer to what you would expect over the last several years. So that's in terms of user activation and first login. So that all looks pretty good. Everything is fine. Obviously, we have a fair bit to go in terms of the submission period. We're only halfway there, but that looks good. In terms of output attribution, this is the next phase that we look at in terms of the journey the users undertake to complete their submissions. So we look at the date an output was attributed in Researchfish. So when they have made a connection between a particular outcome and a particular award. And we use the same time shifting methodology. So here you can see, if we look and compare each of the days, you can see there is a similar pattern to the user activations in that the weekends are very clear. You can see the second half of the UK multi-funder submission period is a period of high activity on each of the days. So you can see on this day, on 2023, there were almost 10,000 new attributions on that particular date. You can see the red, we were a bit lower there. So, and you can see the red versus blue is pretty similar with a couple of big differences. So you can see these very big spikes earlier in January, and those corresponded with some new harvesting that we were able to do over that time. So we're able to go and add information in automatically without the users needing to do that. You can see we also had some harvesting activity in the later part of the submission period, and also actually quite a lot of user activity at this time. And we're about to go into that really busy period. If we look at maximum and minimum, you can see at different points, the red line has been above. Other times it's been sort of quite in the middle of the maximum and the minimum points. And if we were to compare year on year, so compared to last year, you'll see that we are down, relatively speaking, and you can see that's really caused by those two big spikes. But you can see during the actual submission period itself, there are some days where it's been higher, there are some days when it's been lower, but actually it's netting out to very, very similar over the past 3 weeks. So again, proceeding on a sort of a path that's expected. And you can see if we look at the cumulative outputs, you can see there are 2 years where the attributions, the cumulative attributions were higher at this point, and last year had that exceptional amount of harvesting that helped push it back. A lot of backfill as well. And then you can see there are 3 years that are below where we are now. And obviously there's a quite steep curve coming up over the next few weeks. And again, if you just look in terms of maximum and minimum, you can see where we fall there. Now, obviously that's less than last year, but part of the reason for this is some changes in the way that we've been harvesting data. So this next figure is going to look at when outputs were added and how they were added. So these new attributions were harvested, uploaded by a research organization, added as a result of personal harvesting, so from sources like ORCID, whether the user had to search, whether the user had to search and then add something, or whether there was a manual entry. And this looks at the number of attributions, and it looks at the quarter that they were entered into. And so you can see Q1 for each of the years is the year when most of the activity takes place by a long shot. But what you can see if you look at Qs 2 through 4 is that last year in particular, there was a lot more activity going on during Qs 2 through 4, and in particular Q4, and a large amount of harvesting was taking place at this time. So some of the harvesting that in previous years would have been caught up with harvesting in Q1 has actually already been caught in Q4. And again, you can see how last year in Q1 it was exceptionally high, driven by the large amount of harvesting there relative to previous years, which was in part backfill. And in fact, even with that sort of big increase, if we look at just the impact of Qs 2 through 4 in each of the years, you can see the distributions of the types of things across that. So you can see increasing personal harvesting between 22 and 23, increase in harvesting, so quadrupling the amount in 2024, trebling the amount of the personal harvesting, while keeping the manual pieces roughly the same. Even with that really big increase in Q1, this total was 25% of the year. So 1 in 4 outputs that were attributed in 2024 were entered outside of Q1, whereas in other years it was 1 in 5 or even 1 in 6 or lower. So the big increase over that activity there, which has shifted some of those figures in terms of how we look at the number of attributions. So we should really bear that in mind. So far we've covered users logging on for the first time and users going in and attributing outputs to their awards. But the final step is about submission. And so this analysis is going to look at the dates when an award was submitted. And again, we're going to use the time shifting to determine where we might look at it. So if we look at the awards submitted by day, you can see, again, this very strong pattern during the UK multi-funder submission period. You can see when the weekends are, you can see when the end of the submission period is, and you can see that there's very strong patterns from year on year. Some variation that's driven by different communication strategies and emails going out, but certainly at the beginning, there's a lot of similarity year on year. Here we have the Nordics and a number of Danish and other Nordic submission periods running, so that again, there's some variation going on over there as well. In terms of each individual day, you can see yesterday was lower than the maximum day, so about 1,000 lower. And again, it's driven by different communications that users send out. We've been higher at the beginning, and then we've tracked sort of towards the middle or to the lower end of things on individual days during the UK multi-funder submission period. If we just compare this year and last year, you'll see that we started the year going down, and so ended up at this point in early January, mid-January, about 300 below where we were with the equivalent point last year. And then generally we've had days when it's been higher, some days when it's been lower. And currently we're netting out at about 300 submissions more than we had at this point last year. So submissions slightly up. And you can see this when we look at the cumulative graph here. So there's only 1 year that's higher out of this time period so far in terms of number of submissions. But you can also see that actually it's very, very steep, particularly in the final week when many submissions are made. So a bit early to say that everything is fine and set, but at least everything looks consistent with previous years so far. But obviously there's a large number of records that need to be submitted yet. And so you can see that here. in terms of the maximum and minimum. So in addition to looking at when awards were submitted, we also look at which awards are actually doing things at different points. So we're going to look at 2 of the 5 response codes, response code 1 and response code 4. So these are both mandatory type submissions. Response code 1 is a regular submission is required. Response code 4 is a submission is required, but the researcher has moved institution, which creates extra challenges in getting hold of people and communicating with them. So if we look at just response code 1s, and we look by the start year of the award, you can see there is a very strong pattern. If we look here, these greens are the absolute numbers of awards that have been submitted. And we can see here that actually in about the low 20s across each of those years with some variation, that's the percentage of awards starting in that year that are response code 1 that have submitted. If we look at those where the users have logged on, that's going to be the blue. And you can see here, again, a very consistent pattern across the years with a little bit more favoring more recent ones. So 2024, which is going to be the first time some of these awards have been asked to submit, and actually 2023, where there are a number of awards being asked to submit for the first time as well. So that tends up a little bit. And so really we're in the sort of 40s there, rising up to 52% for awards starting in 2024. And then if we look at whether the award has been accepted, so whether the user has accepted the invitation, you can see that for older response code 1s, it's very high in the upper 90s. And for the more recent ones, it's lower because many of these that are not yet accepted, this is the first time that they've been asked to submit. So that's a good indication of there. You can see about 20%, quite a long way to go, but that pattern is holding across that time period, all of those awards by cohorts, rather. And if we look at response code 4s only, we see, again, a very consistent pattern, but overall, the percentages are lower, which is expected given the extra complexity in contacting those users. So rather than submissions at about the 20% mark, they're at about the 10% mark across each of those cohorts. And that first login, first activation this year, rather than being about the 40% mark, is about the 20% mark. So a bit lower there. But again, on track. So if I were to summarize all of the stats we've looked at so far, I would say that there's some interesting variation in terms of the harvesting and attribution patterns, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out over time. But a lot of that activity was brought forward to the later parts of last year, so within the 12-month cycle earlier. But the attribution, the activations and the submissions are both on track and even a little bit above. And the submission status and activity by the different response codes seems very consistent in previous years and seems pretty good across those individual patterns. So I'm just going to pause there and ask, are there any questions on any of the figures, any of the concepts, anything that we've gone through so far? So as I don't see any questions, that's essentially all the figures that I wanted to cover for today. It's worth saying that there are some follow-up webinars that are coming in early April. So we'll have the post multi-funder submission period webinar on April 2nd, looking at the whole of the activity in the quarter. And we also have on that same day another webinar that's looking at how to export and use Researchfish data, so how to get information out of the platform and the sorts of things to consider when using it. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention.
I'm sorry. We have one question from Christopher Webb. Would it be okay to unmute him?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Am I muted now?
You're
Yes,
unmuted now. Yeah.
yes, we can hear you.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks, Kevin. That was interesting. It's good to see we're on track with previous years. So it's good to know. In terms of engagement, like the PIs who haven't yet accepted their Researchfish account, we obviously always get to this time of year, and we rely on them being chased up by the email chaser we send.
Mhm.
But I'm considering putting to my management board actually regenerating the invites this year to try and bump that number up and get that engagement going again. Is there anything you can think of where you wouldn't do that during the submission period, or is that something you'd encourage?
So I mean, invitations that have been sent out, sort of they have a freshness. So after a short period, they will expire and would need to be regenerated again anyway.
Right.
So including those as part of the comms is an easy way for people just to be able to use the links that are sent out rather than to have to go through and be able to regenerate an invitation themselves or ask for one to be sent to them. So it's a perfectly viable strategy to include that. Makes it a bit
Okay,
easier for
brilliant.
researchers.
We'll probably do it next week then. When we send out our kind of final week reminder email, we'll do it in conjunction with just firing out the invitation emails again to those who haven't registered.
Okay,
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Kevin.
no worries. Are there any other questions?
Not from me, Tara.
Mhm. Okay, brilliant. And so in that case, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to uh, stop the recording. Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you have a great day and good luck with the rest of the submission period.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.